When you first start out playing a new racing game such as Forza Horizon 4, it can be sometimes difficult to know which affordable cars you should buy. Most of us tend to set our sights on supercars and race cars for obvious reasons, but what you really need is something that you can afford very quickly without having to rely on the randomness of a wheel spin, and that you can use a lot, on-road, off-road, for various classes, with at least some level of great performance straight out of the box. So stuff like the Beetle or the Fiat 500 doesn't really apply. Now, as far as this list goes, I've compiled what I believe to be the 15 best beginners performance cars currently in Horizon 4. None of these are DLC, you can access all of them immediately as soon as you get the cash, and not a single car on this list will cost you more than 25,000 credits. So, without any further ado, let's get straight into it. Kicking us off first of all, I'm putting the Renault Clio RS. This is the slightly older model, and it will set you back 25 grand, which compared to many of the other vehicles on the list doesn't sound that great for what you actually get. But what you do get is a perfectly acceptable all-round hot hatch, which is compact. You've got around 200 horsepower. It's fun to drive as well, which is of course a bonus. The reason why I'm putting it last on the list is fairly obvious. It's a nice hot hatch, but it's not necessarily going to blow your mind. And there are definitely bigger bang for buck options on this list for the same price. Next up on the list, I'm putting the only muscle car to feature in my top 15, and that is the late 80s Pontiac Trans Am GTA. Now, the reason why it's so low is because, yes, it is an affordable muscle car. In fact, it's one of the cheapest muscle cars in the game. You've got quite a lot of power, quite a lot of torque. It certainly looks the part. But the reason why it's so low is similar to the Clio. It's not bad, but for its power, it's not particularly quick. It's one of those cars that is good, but you really need to start tuning it to see the best results. And of course, the point of this list is that you don't really want to do that much tuning. You want it to be a car that's already good. Next up, I'm putting a car which is similar to the Pontiac in terms of being a bit out of left field, but this one's more the oddball choice, and it certainly appeals to someone like me who likes oddball cars, the less obvious options. It's the Volvo 850R, the only wagon to feature on the list. It's front-wheel drive, you can convert it to rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, so you've got plenty of options. It's not the quickest thing out there, but it's certainly the option for those who want to try something a bit more strange, something that's in line with the kind of weirdness that Forza Horizon likes to feature with the Reliant Supervans and the Peel P50s. Not the quickest thing out there, but certainly an enticing option if you're that way inclined. Next up on the list, I'm putting a car which I wasn't even sure if I wanted to feature, and that's the Mini. The Mini John Cooper Works. And the reason why I ultimately did feature it is because it's a lot better than I was expecting. Not only do you have some pretty cool looking body kit options and aero options from Liberty Walk, but it's actually just a really good car. And that shouldn't really surprise me, but in the world of Forza it kind of does, because Minis are easy to overlook. This one though, it's good. The performance goes beyond its raw power would suggest. It's got great handling, it's relatively compact compared to many of the others here, such as the aforementioned wagon and muscle car, and it's a good all-rounder. If you're into minis, definitely worth a look, especially given the fact that it is only 25 grand. Next up, rounding out the first 5 vehicles here, I'm putting one of my personal favourites on the list, the Talbot Sunbeam Lotus. Previously a DLC car, of course, in Horizon 3, now it's in Horizon 4 as standard, and this is a great one. It's the least powerful car on the list, but it ain't the slowest, that's for sure. This is a rally legend. The power is only 150 horsepower, but what it can do with that is fantastic. Think of it as kind of like a classic Ford Fiesta, but with the attitude of something more like a Group B car. That's a pretty great combination to have, and it's already rear-wheel drive, so you can use it for drifting. It's excellent for rally because it was designed for that in the first place, and it's got a lovely retro vibe to it. This, out of these first 5 cars in particular, is definitely one that I'd recommend quite strongly. Next up, I'm putting technically 2 cars in the same space, and that is the Honda Civic Type R. Not the newest one, but in particular this shape that you can see here, and of course the iconic EK from the late 90s. Now this car is 20 grand, the EK will set you back 25, so I'm putting them as interchangeable. This one is slightly more powerful, slightly newer, whereas the EK is a legend for a reason. and although it is a little bit more expensive, you can understand why. So either way, you know exactly what you're going to get with the Civic Type R. High revving VTEC engine, front wheel drive, very good straight out of the box. I think of the two, I'd probably recommend the older one though. It's a little bit more nimble, and although it's slightly less powerful, what it can do with its power is very reminiscent of the Mini. It's a great all-rounder, and anyone who's checked out my drag build for that Civic knows just how quick it can be. 0 to 60 in 1.3 seconds is pretty impressive. Next up, a pick for the drifters out there. This one will definitely appeal to the JDM fans, the Nissan 240SX. Now, to clarify, you can actually buy quite a few of the S chassis vehicles in the game, like the S13, the S14, for around the same kind of price. So in a similar way to the Civic, you could view this as more cars in one, but the reason why I picked out the 240 in particular is because you have excellent visual tuning on it in terms of the body kit. It's got a great racer vibe, aka JDM, you know, whichever way you tend to look at it as, and it's a good all-rounder. It looks the part, it's got great performance. When you fully tune it as well, it's a drag monster, fantastic for drifting. It's got the all-round package that you would want from a JDM car. Next up, I'm putting a less obvious choice, the Vauxhall Astra VXR. Now, personally, I never use the Astra that much in any of the Forza games, Horizon or otherwise, but the reality is, if you actually look at the spec sheet of this car and then drive it, it's really good. It's got around the same kind of power as an Evo or an NSX. It is front-wheel drive, of course, but what you can do with it straight off the bat for 25 grand is actually very healthy. It's a pretty good, less obvious rival to stuff like the Ford Focus RS or the Megane, and I would say this is a really good, if completely undervalued, hot hatch. This one is definitely worth a look if you're the kind of person who likes to be different from the crowd and try something that's kind of a sleeper. It's technically not a sleeper car, but people just don't use them. And it's definitely worth checking out because it's a good hot hatch. Next up, in 7th place, I'm putting easily one of my favourite cars on the list, the DC2 Acura Integra Type R. I personally wish it was the Honda version with the Japanese headlights instead of the projector lamps, but be that as it may, despite the fact that like the Mini or the Talbot is less powerful, it's got under 200 horsepower, but what you can do with an Integra, especially a DC2, speaks for itself. This is a fantastic car. I personally consider it to be the best front-wheel drive car ever made. It's strong across the board, and for 25 grand you get a JDM Legend, which I think can actually appeal to people who aren't necessarily JDM fans, but are just fans of great performance cars in general. This is definitely one of my personal favourites on the list. For sheer power, it's not going to lead the pack, but it's a strong all-rounder nonetheless. Next up, a car which was very difficult not to put in my top 5. A car which will definitely be popular as soon as you realise that you can buy it for 25 grand, especially near the start of the game. It's strong across the board, the Honda S2000 CR. Personally, I would have preferred a regular S2000. This one's a bit gimmicky with the wing and the buttresses, but it's fast. That is unarguable. 250 horsepower is a lot more than most of the other JDM cars on this list. It's of course a rear-wheel drive sports car. It's known for being a high-revving, tail-happy drift monster straight out of the bat. It's great. Simply put, it's a great all-round car. Personally, I'm not a huge S2000 fan, but even so, I will still admit it's a really good car. It's fast immediately as well, and as far as beginners go, it's one of the few sports cars which you can start the game with that will actually last the majority of the races you'll need to do once you start upgrading it. It's just that good. Next up, we have the car that I wasn't sure whether or not I wanted to replace the S2000 with or not, because it's less powerful, but I think that the car has more of the cool factor running in its favour. The FC Mazda RX7. Now, the other RX7s don't cost that much more anyway, but the ceiling is 25 grand, so we have to stick to that. So for 25 grand, you get an icon. Of course, just like the 240SX, it's a drift icon. Like the Integra, it's a performance icon. You have a pretty awesome looking body kit that you can turn into the Group B rally car with. And the performance is great because, need I remind you, yes, you can indeed swap it with a quad-rotor racing rotary engine. That alone makes it worthy of hitting the list, and for me, the RX-7 is just a whole package. Regardless of if you give it all-wheel drive and 800 horsepower, it's just great anyway. Next up, I'm putting a car which you probably didn't even think would be here. And that's exactly why it is. It's a total sleeper, and if I told you that you could basically start the game, or very soon after starting the game, buy yourself a rear-wheel drive BMW M5 with 340 horsepower that is drift ready straight out of the box, has more than enough grunt to get the job done, and has upper tuning potential of around 270 miles per hour, you probably wouldn't believe me, but here it is. The only thing is, it's a slightly older model, and as far as M5s go, it's pretty much the most understated one there is. So it's a total sleeper. You never really see people using these online, and that's exactly why it's a great car. As far as power goes, it's one of the best on this whole list. Well over 300 horsepower for 25 grand with rear-wheel drive. Job done. Definitely worth checking out. And speaking of power of around 300 or more, what better car to have in third place than my personal favourite variation of the Ford Focus RS, the 2009 variation. This one has all of the great stuff about the newer shape, apart from the all-wheel drive, but it's just got more attitude than the old school RS, and funnily enough, it's actually cheaper by about 5 grand. For 25 grand you get, yes, front wheel drive, but you get 300 horsepower. So the way that I would describe this car is, imagine if you crossed the Clio RS and the Integra Type R. Put those two together, you basically get this. It's got the excellent front wheel drive chassis of something like an Integra, but way more power than something like the Clio or the Integra would have. In fact, it's got more power than the RX7, more power than the 240SX, more power than a lot of the cars on this list. 300 horsepower straight off the bat, it looks fantastic. Upper end tuning is very strong as well. The Focuses are among the fastest hot hatches in the game, and of course it comes from, let's just say, a pretty well proven history of rally racing, so a strong all-rounder, and definitely one of my personal favourites here. Moving up into second place though, in a very similar way to the BMW M5, this car has been around for so long in the franchise and has such an understated appearance that it's easy to forget just how good it is. The Mark IV Golf R32, and the thing that's always bugged me about this Golf in Forza is the proportions. The back end looks completely wrong, it's way too square, but even with that being said, you're basically getting something that's like a Subaru Impreza, but in the package of a hatchback. You've got all-wheel drive, 3.2 litre V6, over 240 horsepower. The all-wheel drive means it's fantastic both on and off-road in any kind of weather. The launch off the line is fantastic, it sounds great, and people don't use them as much anymore. They go for the cliches of the Meganes and the Focuses. This one is definitely worth a look, and to cap it all off, this is the cheapest car on the whole list, 20 grand. That is a bargain. Definitely check out the Golf if you want a strong all-rounder. But what then about first place? Well, in first place I'm putting the car that you probably didn't even think of, and just like the Beamer, that's exactly why it's here. Because in first place I'm putting this. Yes, ladies and gents, the Vauxhall Monaro VXR. And as you'll see in this portion of the gameplay, this one clearly isn't stock. In fact, it has a well over 1200 horsepower V10 Viper engine conversion, and no, your eyes don't deceive you, that speedo is not in kilometers per hour. This is a 270 mile per hour car. Now of course it doesn't do that straight out of the box, but that's the whole great thing about the Monaro. What you do get out of the box for 25,000 credits is a Corvette engined rear-wheel drive 400 horsepower car that, get this, can already do 186 miles per hour without any tuning whatsoever. It's a tail-happy drift monster that nobody uses, is completely undervalued, and it's beefy. The Monaro is a modern-day muscle car, and if you're looking for sheer performance for the lowest possible price, literally nothing else in the game is as good as this. 270 miles per hour for 25 grand is ridiculous. So overall, if you try any of the cars on this list, you'll get a lot of use out of them. Some I would definitely recommend more than others, of course, as I mentioned, and if you want to check out tuning for these cars and plenty of others, reviews, hints, tips, tricks, breakdowns, more countdowns even, then of course click through here on screen and stick around here on the channel. But for now, as always, Thanks for watching.